Our next panelist is Jennifer Ciardelli, and she directs the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's leadership programs. This division is tasked with creating educational resources and programs for professionals charged with protecting life and liberty. The key audiences include law enforcement, the judiciary, the military, and select government audiences. Examining the Holocaust prompts critical thinking about professional roles and responsibilities, decision-making in complex environments, and mass atrocity prevention. Jennifer's work also includes global outreach, which engages educational stakeholders around the world on teaching and learning about the Holocaust and genocide prevention. So I can now give the floor to Jennifer.
Thank you. Thanks. And in fact, I will not be talking about the work that I do with professionals today, so I'll share some different work at the museum. But first, I'd like to thank the foundation and, of course, Nayet, and just the incredible team here for not only including me in this convening, but for just being part of this thought-provoking and inspiring gathering. So I hope that what I share in this session can contribute to our collective thinking about how we think about these really challenging pasts in proactive ways moving forward. So a significant challenge to engaging people in authentic and meaningful ways is that the history keeps moving further into the past. An irony is that even as our first-hand witnesses are passing, references to the Holocaust seem to increase in popular culture and political rhetoric, sources that prove to be more influential even than the classroom. And yet knowledge in these forums is often diluted or incomplete. At worst, it's wrong or intentionally misleading, and I think this morning we started to think about some of these dynamics. In explaining the events of the Holocaust, people often gloss over the nuance and the complexity, and in fact, a recent research study in the UK showed that students often simplify their understanding of the Holocaust to Hitler killed all of the Jews, right? In the United States, a recent survey showed that only 49% of millennials cannot name a single camp. And additionally, many societies are increasingly polarized such that values and democratic norms that united us, even the concept that Nazis are bad, may spark debate. So how do we navigate such uncertain territory? When the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened 25 years ago, Elie Wiesel, survivor of the Holocaust and the museum's founding chairman, noted that the museum is not an answer, it's a question. And in fact, it's many questions. So our National Museum, which is both federally funded and receives donated funds, continues to embrace its responsibility to honor the victims by preserving the memory of the Holocaust, and we're also fueled by this idea of questions. So this short video provides a sampling of some of the questions that are on the minds of people in the United States right now about this history of the Holocaust.
Why do we learn about the Holocaust?
In today's world, it's more important than ever for people to learn that even when they are surrounded by hate, it is possible for them to do what is right.
I've asked myself a lot of tough questions about the Holocaust. What's your question?
How could this have happened?
How could human beings be so cruel to one another?
Why?
Why?
Why? Why is it so easy to teach people to hate?
How does someone go from being a neighbor or a friend,
parent or a husband or wife at home, and then do that to other people?
What would you do in that moment?
Is there a way for me to change the future based on what I've seen in the past?
Do you want to help break through ignorance and divisions that are plaguing our society? Start by asking the questions. Ask your question.
So those questions, we cut them for the video, but we actually had a gathering session of letting people speak about what their questions were, so they were not scripted. We didn't write that for them. And these questions may not be new to many of us in the room, but they do remind us why this historical event matters, because the questions they're asking speak to human choice and human agency, right? They speak about the how and the why. The questions remind us that genocide is not inevitable, that it is, in fact, the result of human agency, of human decision-making. So asking the questions has led us to rethink some of our educational approaches. And in the past, for example, we would create a special exhibition, usually based on a topic, and then we would create our educational materials afterwards. So now we try to create what we call education initiatives. And from the very start, these include a multi-pronged approach that are designed to ask hard questions both on and off-site. So our current education initiative explores Americans and the Holocaust. And it asks questions that our American audiences have always been asking, which is, what did people in the United States know at the time, and what influenced how we responded to this information? So this examination isn't about perpetrators or victims, it's about witnesses, right? It's about what one group of people understood about what was happening to another group of people in a different place. And as we'll see, even when large-scale violence unfolds elsewhere, important questions surface about one's own role and responsibility in society. So while the whole initiative has many components, I will share 3 today. One is the exhibition itself, a second is a citizen history project, and a third is public programs and community forums. So again, people in the United States ask, well, what did we in the United States know at the time? And most people assume that we knew very little. So as part of the 5-year research phase that went into creating, or as part of this initiative, we wanted to find out what people knew by looking through local newspapers. And we wanted to collect articles from across the nation, which exceeded our capacity, right? We couldn't deploy researchers everywhere. So we used a citizen history project to invite people from across the United States to scour their local newspapers to find out what had been reported in the 1930s and 40s about the events of the Holocaust. So to date, over 3,000 people have submitted over 27,000 articles, which are now available online, but are also available in the exhibition. So this interactive map is one of the features where people can pick a state and have options to read entries from local newspapers that they would likely recognize. Now, we can't prove that with the articles everyone knew, but it does show that information was available in this format. And beyond newspapers, newsreels existed and reported events in real time. And these are also featured on site and online. So this short film shows American newsreels depicting Germany's annexation of Austria and also showing the rising crisis of German and Austrian Jews seeking a safe haven.
German troops by the thousands moved into Austria to make the annexation complete in a military and political coup that has startled the world.
The next morning, Viennese awake to find their city no longer the country's proud old capital, but a new outpost in the ruthless Nazi realm.
Die österreichische Gesetzgebung wird hiermit der des Deutschen Reiches gleichgeschaltet.
Dictator Hitler, with the speed of a thunderbolt, has added to Germany 32,377 square miles, nearly 7 million subjects, and lands rich in agriculture and mineral resources.
And here you see, right, some of the news headlines that are featured elsewhere in the exhibit.
The dream of almost every one of Hitler's victims is to emigrate to the United States. But U.S. immigration is restricted by law to a selective annual quota from each foreign country. From Germany, 27,000 each year. Every immigrant must have found someone in the United States to guarantee that he will not become a public charge.
So, another source that showed topics being addressed in the public forum were public opinion polls. And these were conducted, throughout the century, but in particular in the 1930s and 40s. And the polls touched on topics including the 1936 Olympics, war, the economy, how Jews were being treated in Germany. And you can see in this poll from 1938, it shows that while 94% of Americans disapproved of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany, only 72% did not think that we should change our immigration quotas in order to allow more people entry. And incidentally, feedback shows that visitors and people today are pretty fascinated by these polls, as well as the headlines and the newsreels. And these sources of information show that people had access to information, and many were even forming and articulating opinions on what we should do. It's interesting to remind ourselves that even when evidence of persecution and eventually large-scale killing against Jews is reported, the United States enters the war against Germany not to end these killings, but to combat the ideology of Nazism, which was seen as a threat to democracy at home. So this 1942 war bonds poster shows how Nazism was seen as a threat to the very red, white, and blue American way of life. And we'll return to this a bit later. So we must remind ourselves, right, in thinking about impact and how we understand these events, that having access to information is only part of the equation. Information did not translate into consensus about how we should respond. And while we present case studies of individuals and groups taking action, people want to understand why the actions were taken or not taken. So a question, if information was available, what was influencing how people responded? So the entry to the exhibition tries to create what America was like in the 1920s and 30s by posing these questions of what were the challenges that Americans faced? What was the domestic context at the time? So we try to look at history forward, try to minimize hindsight, and try to create the context within which people were receiving the newsreels and the newspaper articles. So this is the film that people encounter when they enter the exhibit, and it is available online as well. So these images provide just a glimpse of the fears consuming America in the 20s and 30s. So factors such as xenophobia, anti-Semitism, economic concerns help us to explain those 1938 statistics where Americans may have been empathetic but not quite willing to change immigration quotas. And each of these fears is worthy of unpacking, obviously, in more detail, and we do in various initiatives, but today I want to focus on one, which is racism. So while we in the United States have been good at exploring the history of the Holocaust, we can do much more work unpacking our own relationship with racism. And questions about race surface when Americans see photographs of segregation of German Jews in Germany in the 1930s. So this photograph of a woman sitting on a bench for Jews only, for example, makes people in the United States often think of Jim Crow laws in the United States or segregation in our United States at the same time. And this photograph from North Carolina has an African-American boy drinking from a water fountain, right, designated for blacks. So not only were we segregating our own minority population, our approaches actually served as models to the Nazis as they implemented their own system of discrimination. So another question, what can we learn about the forms and functions of racism? So a bit of context. We know that racism, including racial anti-Semitism, fueled Nazi ideology and thus the Holocaust. And we know that in the United States, racism also legitimized the continued oppression and persecution of African Americans long after the end of the Civil War in 1865. So in the 1930s, for example, blacks suffered discrimination in most areas of American life. Jim Crow laws, which were designed by whites to keep blacks segregated and separate, prohibited access to many occupations and to public spaces or private spaces, including restaurants, hotels, right, parks. And in the South especially, blacks lived in fear of racially motivated violence. The Equal Justice Initiative in the United States documents over 4,000 lynchings of African Americans between 1877 and 1950. And during that time frame, only one individual was ever held accountable for any of the thousands of murders. And the United States military was also still segregated during World War II. So although different in many ways, the history of racism in Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South during the 30s highlights some universal dynamics at play in both contexts. So for one, both forms can trace part of their roots to the study of eugenics, right? The new science of eugenics, which became an international movement and was used to give legitimacy to racial policies. Another element is that both use the law in order to formalize racism throughout society. So the Jim Crow race laws began after the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which freed millions of enslaved people. As Yale Law School professor James Whitman notes, Nazi lawyers were interested in, looked very closely at, and were ultimately influenced by American race law. A third similarity is that the Nazis used the US model of anti-interracial marriage laws, which were prominent in 30 of 48 states, and they also prohibited interracial sex. Professor Whitman also notes that America had, by a wide margin, the harshest law of this kind. And another aspect that the Nazis admired and borrowed was the legal system of classification to determine who was who. One-drop rules in the United States identified that anyone with any black ancestry was considered black and therefore prohibited from marrying a white person. And similar laws also were applied to Asians and Native Americans. So based on this concept, right, the Nazis developed their own Nuremberg laws, but determined that a Jewish person was anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents, which was actually a more lenient system than the one-drop system in the United States. So as Whitman again points out, American racial classification laws were much harsher than anything the Nazis themselves were willing to introduce in Germany. And another difference is that the Nazis didn't think the US model of race laws, even as harsh as they were, went far enough for their goals, right? The contexts were different. In the United States, the African American population was predominantly oppressed and poor. German Jews, however, had been integrated into mainstream society and were more often financially and successful citizens. The Nazis believed they needed to be harsher in their methods to marginalize the Jews. Dr. Beverly Eileen Mitchell, who's a professor of historical theology, notes, both Black Americans and German Jews were dehumanized, but the rationalizations were different, so the results were different. Yet looking at the differences can teach us just as much. So as I mentioned earlier, the United States fought Nazism as a threat to democracy, thereby sidestepping completely the issue of racial discrimination. In the white press, there was essentially no mention of Nazi racism. Articles in the African American press, however, always made an explicit connection between racism and the treatment of minorities in the US and Nazi Germany. A 1943 poem by African-American poet Langston Hughes asks, "How long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow." So it's important to note that racism in the United States, of course, did not cause racism in Nazi Germany, yet it's also important to recognize that Nazi policymakers were keenly aware of the system of race-based laws and policies that effectively established a system of segregation and tiered citizenship in the United States. As uncomfortable as a truth as it may be, the United States did provide Nazi lawmakers with one possible model of what a racial state could look like and how it could function. So considering how racism functioned in both Nazi Germany and the US is not meant to equate suffering or gloss over the uniqueness, it simply provides an important lens to better understand how discrimination can affect those witnessing discrimination elsewhere. And while racism is touched on in the exhibition, we've had most success creating public forums and community environments where people from different segments of their community can engage in responsible, meaningful, and informed dialogue to unpack the histories together. The study is challenging and it engages two traumatic pasts. So the examination must be carefully framed. How does racism look and function in different societies, for example? A benefit is that we can engage with folks who might not believe the Holocaust holds anything of interest for them. So our multi-pronged education initiatives, of which I only gave 3 examples, show how we're trying to engage people both on and off-site in meaningful ways by exploring the questions that they're asking. Not only do we hope to examine the historical record with clarity, we hope that this examination will provide a mechanism for people to unpack social dynamics still at play today, including racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, those dynamics that continue to influence how we make choices about contemporary challenges both home and in our global community. So the questions remind us that it is not enough to know, we must strive to also understand. And the questions remind us again that genocide is not inevitable. It's a process that moves forward because of human agency and decision-making. So by unpacking the history, we hope people will ask not what would I have done, but what will I do? Thank you.